I love networking. I love connecting people together with what our projects are and what they love and what they're passionate with. And so that's how I think about it.
Hi, my name is Megan Jensen, and I'm the Director of Programs for the American Theater Wing, and I'd like to welcome you to the Network for Emerging Leaders in the Theater. The network bridges information and access for emerging theater leaders by providing conversations, insight, connections, and networking opportunities for young professionals interning and working in theater administration roles, both artistic and executive. You can support the American Theater Wing and help us continue to provide free resources like this conversation today to the next generation of arts workers. There is no donation too small. We're sending a link right now via the chat, so you can go ahead and give us a donation or make a contribution by visiting us at americantheaterwing.org.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful to you and the Wing for bringing us all together here today. It's such a pleasure to have this time to talk about the very important work of development and fundraising. And the great secret that we were just talking about as we were getting ready to come on today is that it's one of the most creative parts of the industry. And it's one without which so much great artistic work could never happen. So it's both critical and creative and actually can be fun. So it's really cool to be here with a whole generation of new talent who's interested in working in development, and to have a chance to bring together this A-list team of development professionals to talk to you all about it. So I am very pleased to welcome our panelists. I'm going to introduce everyone very briefly. I think you have full bios of everyone, and I encourage you to check out their impressive accomplishments. But I want us to really dive right into the conversation and have time to answer all your questions. So with us today, we have LaTeshia Ellerson, Director of Development at Kenny Leon's True Colors Theater Company in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, LaTeshia. Matt Merrill, Director of Development at Chicago Children's Theater. Hey, Matt. Oliver Pattenden, Director of Development at Classic Stage Company in New York City. And Ebonie Pittman, Senior Director of Development at Dance Theater of Harlem, also here in New York. So welcome, everybody. I thought we would begin at the beginning and have each of you just talk about how you got started in development. What was your first job in development and how did you get it?
I'm so glad to be here with everyone. So I fell into development. My first job was actually at United Way in Chicago. I had recently graduated as with a BFA in acting, theater performance. And so United Way was my daytime job while I worked at the Second City with improv theater in the evening. And so isn't that fun? But the coolest thing about the job, I would have to say, is at United Way, I was a part of the combined federal campaign. And so I was able to use my theater skills to talk about the impact of United Way to a large group of post office workers in the bulk centers. And so capturing their attention, that's how I started at fundraising.
Amazing. Yeah, we want to keep talking about those core skills that are transferable from other parts of your experience. So that's awesome. Oliver.
I also sort of fell into development. I think it sort of found me in a roundabout sort of way. I got started working. I really wanted to work in the arts. It was something that just really was important to me, a big part of my life. I'm not talented enough to make art or do anything that's worth anyone's time, but I really felt passionate about it being something that would be that's an important part of my life that should be an important part of everyone's lives. And I wanted to make sure that it was sort of thriving. And I discovered very early on in my career in an internship at the Film Society of Lincoln Center, where we were holding it was my first day. They said, could you pitch in and help out with a donor event? And I thought that sounded so stuffy and boring and not interesting. But all of a sudden I realized that I was around people who really, really cared about that art form and were there because they supported it and they loved it. They wanted to see it thrive. And I thought, I want to be a part of this as well and help continue this art form to thrive. So I actually started working in kind of visitor services at Lincoln Center, which was a way of interacting with lots of people and getting to know kind of the ropes of how an organization worked, and then kind of move that into a membership position at New York City Opera, which is sadly went bankrupt while I was there, but that ended up meaning that I got a real education in development, because I ended up doing a little bit of everything while we kind of needed to sort of steady the ship while I was there. So sort of from membership and visitor services into a front-facing position where I was interacting with more donors.
Ebonie?
So I also was not planning on starting a career in development. I think that seems to be a trend for a lot of people I know who now work in this field. My background is in dance. I always knew that I had a dual interest in both the performing side as well as the business side. So my undergraduate degree is in dance. My master's is in arts administration. And when I came out of graduate school, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but the one thing I said I was not going to do was development. And lo and behold, years later, I'm now the Senior Director of Development at Dance Theater of Harlem. My first exposure to development was actually via an internship program. Right before I graduated from undergrad, I was a general administrative intern at the Bates Dance Festival in Lewiston, Maine, which was kind of all encompassing, but part of that was having access to the grant writer that was on staff there at the time, and she let me, help her with a few projects. It was interesting to me. I quickly understood the importance of fundraising and development for institutions, but it wasn't something that was top of mind for me in that moment. And fast forward, there was a time I was working at the Wallace Foundation. I was giving the money away. I was a program associate for the arts when I first came out of graduate school. I was at the Wallace Foundation for 3 years, left, kind of had my eat, pray, love moment, moved to Australia, came back to the States. And fast forward, next thing I knew, I was interning again as a development intern at the North Carolina Theater. I'm a native North Carolinian. And next thing I knew, I found myself making my way back to New York City, where I took the manager of institutional support position at American Ballet Theater. And I was at ABT prior to joining dance theater about a year ago. So that's my around the world, literally, travels to get to fundraising and development.
Along the lines of the theme of falling into development, I think we have a lot of people who are interested in falling into development and want to kind of know more about the skills that they need to do that, to either transition into development or to add that to an artistic career that they may have. So I'd love people's thoughts on some of those skills, the core skills that you need to succeed, because I think people may have those skills already more than they think, and it may just be a question of sort of really honing in on what those skills are and figuring out how to put those front and center when going forward for job opportunities. So I'll throw it open. Anyone, whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I can start by saying I think one of the really key skills is basically having communication. That a lot of, whether you're writing grants, interacting in person with donors, writing appeal letters to large groups of people, you really need to have those skills of how to tell the story that you're trying to tell to convince people to give, to be able to kind of communicate very efficiently, very effectively. Those are kind of the skills I think are very fundamental in all areas of development. But I think there's also beyond that. I mean, it's a very busy job. There's always something happening, whether it's an event or an end of year appeal. Something's always going on. So you have to really be very good at time management and organizational skills, and making sure that you're have your sort of priorities set, but that you're always able to multitask as well. And I think the other thing that's really key is there's a lot of very specific interpersonal skills that I think are important. Weirdly, I think one thing is that you really need to be able to do is sort of not really have any shame, because when it comes to either asking for money or having a conversation about need, you can't really. If there is some donor to donor, of course, how you want to manage the tone, but you really, if you come across as sort of embarrassed or about asking, it never kind of sets the right conversation. You need to be able to be sort of very frank and very open about the need of an organization and why you're asking, and that really helps have kind of an open and honest conversation with the donor, whether that be a big foundation or someone who's giving you $100, having been able to have that conversation openly is really important. And similarly to that, weirdly, I found that it's really helpful to be very good at being very contrite. If you can apologize and on behalf of an organization, I really know how to be kind of the person who speaks to what an individual donor might be, issues they might be having with an organization, or some questions they might have. Being able to kind of make that personal connection is really important. So there's a different type of communication skills, but sort of falls under that umbrella as well.
I think right along with what you were saying, the idea is that you have to be authentic, right? Like, it's very important that if you're going to be, or at least I feel like the people who are best at it are the people who truly believe in the organization they work for. And that comes across when they're communicating the mission and when they're asking for money. If you're not authentically engaged in the organization, that's going to show through. So in addition to those concrete skills, like organization, the ability to meet deadlines, the ability to work under pressure, I think, is not an underrated one, and be able to kind of keep an even keel. There is a moment of panic every time right before I hit the submit button on a grant, that I hope I didn't screw something up that is going to mess up the organization or make my year a lot harder. Same thing when I'm up there for the paddle raise for the gala, where I'm thinking the next 2 minutes is either going to determine how hard my next few months are going to be or how easy it's going to be. So I think being able to keep that even keel in those times of pressure is really important.
LaTeshia, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback off of what was already been said, and what you said, Matt, is so funny. Something that I think it's funny, what you said, Matt, is there's an adrenaline rush, I think. And so I'm going to talk about the fun aspects. And so being a performer, especially when you're at fundraising events where the pressure is on, for me, I felt as if it's showtime. This is my time to shine. And I felt that adrenaline rush just as if I was on stage. So if you like that kind of rush, this could be an avenue for you. Also, something that I think is interesting, going along with what you mentioned, Oliver, about communication. The fun aspect of the communication is relationship building. And so if you're an extrovert, and even if you are an introvert, but you enjoy connecting with people, where you're connecting on a level of mutual interest, right? That's a great entryway into this work and then into the field and growing in your skill sets as well too. I love networking. I love connecting people together with what our projects are and what they love and what they're passionate with. And so that's how I think about it, especially in going in for the ask. That's how I take the pressure off of myself. In those moments, I think about, this is what you really care about. And so I'm just providing you an opportunity to give towards what you really care about. And so I like to frame it in that way when I'm working and developing relationships with people.
I'll just add one other thing beyond the relationship piece and the interpersonal skills, since my colleagues here have certainly tapped on that already, is also the forward thinking, the forward planning. One thing that we do as development officers, we are fundraising a year out. So when we're talking about communicating with colleagues, it's also within your organization, talking to your artistic directors. What is your plan for the next year? What would you like to see? What are the new projects, new works, so that we can begin to develop stories and narratives for those particular initiatives, and having to do that well in advance. I think it's top of mind for me right now, because we're getting ready to plan. We're in the midst of finalizing our FY22 budget, and I'm trying to figure out, what is not in it right now that I need to know about now, so that I can come up with a strategy for it. So it's the strategic planning and thinking. We really are obviously a core piece of an institution, of a not-for-profit institution. There's the artistic piece, of course, but obviously earned income alone does not sustain an organization. If that were the case, then we wouldn't need to be here as development professionals. So I just kind of wanted to add that as a piece to the conversation as we think about skills. It's also the forward thinking and the planning that also does not happen in a vacuum either across an organization.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think it's such a big part of what makes the field of development so interesting, is that you're often in the middle of those conversations about where an organization can go, what kind of additional capacities it needs to to be able to achieve what it wants to achieve, and making that possible is super exciting. So I'm curious, I bet all of you have been involved in hiring development staff. And so like, how do those core skills that you need, like, how do you know what you're looking for when you're looking for, say, an entry level or mid-level candidate? And what kinds of things should people be? I mean, there was a question about, I want to get into this field. How do I start to build the experience so that I can get a job? And I think to my mind, there's like two parts of that. One is, are there things that people can do in terms of volunteer work or other things to build that experience, but also how can people put the core skills and experience that they already have out there on their resumes in a way that will make people doing the hiring take notice and understand that they could do the job?
Well, I can go first. Shameless plug, True Colors is hiring for annual fund manager. And so I'm in the midst of that right now. And so what is important for me, and when I'm looking at is, of course, relatable skill sets, right? And so even if you haven't had development experience prior, it's important to at least have some sort of professional development, right? And so, for instance, if you already work at an institution where they provide opportunities for you to gain skills that, even if you, it's not related to theater, development and fundraising is across the board in all nonprofit institutions. And so other from fundraising professionals, Association of Fundraising Professionals, working with them, attending meetings, networking with other development professionals, learning from them, right? Outside of the arts even. I've done that myself, right? Most of my mentors are actually not in the arts. They're actually in university systems, and even in some hospitals as well too. And so there's ways that you can learn and grow by being a part and networking with others. I would also have to say, making sure that if you have some relatable skill sets, making sure you're looking at the job description and putting that related experience at the top. And making sure that the person who's reviewing the resume can see those connections very clearly, and making it easy for us. And so we don't have to interpret in our own minds, I think they could be able to do this, or that they have the skills, but making it very clear that what you've done in previous organizations, that you will be able to execute in X, Y, and Z. And also I would suggest, you're in a theater organization, ask the development people on staff, hey, can I help write a grant? Can you show me? Like, I would love to learn how to do this. And they can, and I've done this before for others as well too. Here's a grant that's due in 6 months. Take a stab at it. And then from there, you can, building camaraderie internally as well too. So that's also a strategy. And relationship building, going on calls and ask with development people on staff, especially if you're on the programming and or different administrative capacity. There's definitely ways for you to start building those skill sets while you're already at an institution.
We definitely look for a range of backgrounds. It's always great when you have candidates that have development experience or have maybe it's an internship or some position, or even if it's with a club or an alumni association or something like that, that they have some understanding of fundraising. But it's often just very helpful if someone clearly can show the understanding of how an organization like yours works. Like I say, my background started more in marketing and visitor services, but through those positions, I got a real understanding of how development fit in with the whole sort of puzzle of an organization, and was able to kind of, draw lines to the different work that I did and how it connected to development. So at least able to demonstrate an understanding of what development means. So when you, have an interview or putting yourself sort of forward for a role like that, you can really show at least fundamentally you have the understanding, so you're able to learn and you have that context. It's very key. Another thing that I think is very important that I often look for is, it's great. So if we're, at the theater I work at now, if we're hiring, obviously it's great to see that somebody has a background in theater, so we know that they can talk to donors about theater. But I also really like to see candidates who have who are very well-rounded, who might have had a degree in history or something else, because I know that they're not just going to talk to donors about theater and seem like that's their whole world, that's their whole life, and they're just there to talk to you about theater and get your money to support the theater, but that they have other interests that maybe they can build connections with donors that'll be more well-rounded and maybe seem more, to Matt's point, sort of authentic. So that I also look for as well, is to make sure that people have a broad background.
Yeah, LaTeshia, what you brought up about highlighting your applicable experience in a strong way on your resume, I think that's some of the best advice I've heard. I have a quick story about an intern that I had, and I hope they're not listening, and I hope they don't feel bad about this, because I already pointed it out to them many years ago. But we gave them this really rich internship experience where they wrote a grant and they met with board members and they did all of this high-level stuff that we look for on resumes when we're hiring. And then when they gave me their resume to look over, the top of the resume listed dog walker as the first experience. And I'm like, you're not going to get an interview if you put that on the top of your resume. Put all of this stuff that we worked on over the summer at the top of your resume. So that's just like an example that might not always occur to people. It seems like it would be logical, but it really isn't. And it's really great advice to give to young people out there who are doing their resume. And the other thing that I would say that we really need to look for and hire for in the nonprofit world is character. And I think it is absolutely a quantifiable thing. And I think it's something that you can uncover through the questions that you ask and through the course of an interview. So I think people should come into interviews expecting to get those kinds of questions as well. Like, what are you truly passionate about in your life? What would your family say are 3 words to describe you? What are 3 words that would describe you? What was your first job and what was your motivation for getting it? Those are all things that kind of can uncover like somebody's real character kind of underneath. And I think that's really important when you're hiring for jobs like these.
I completely agree with that, Matt. For me, I've been very fortunate. I came in as the Director of Development at Dance Theater of Harlem just shy of a year ago, and I've been able to build my team. There was 1 person here, 1.5, I guess, when I started. We are now a team of 5, and we'll be 6 before the close of this calendar year, and I could not be more thrilled, especially since Dance Theater for so many years was basically without a development team. So I've had the opportunity to hire directors, I've hired a development associate, and I've hired a manager very recently. And while yes, so all those applicable skills as outlined, in the job description that you might see online, yes, you need to highlight those. But to piggyback off of what Matt was just saying, there's also something about the personality. For me, I can quickly tell, one, if I think that you are a fit for this organization, and if you are a fit for me and the rest of my team. Because so some of it's also a personality thing. And I just want to be very honest about that. And sometimes, there were a couple of people who interviewed for some of the positions we had open. They could do the job. Absolutely, they could do the job, but they were not a great fit for Dance Theater of Harlem. In part, we are a predominantly BIPOC organization. You need to be able to understand what that means, especially within the context of the world that we're living in today. That doesn't mean that you need to identify as a person of color necessarily, but you must understand who we are as an institution, and in some way be able to articulate that you understand who we are as an institution when you're interviewing with us. And there are some people who just weren't able to do that. Could they get it eventually? Perhaps, yes, you can certainly write the grant proposal and submit it, of course, but it's about so much more. We are very much a mission and values driven organization here, and who we bring in they have got to be able to demonstrate that they align with that. We are not just ballet. We are not just ballet. We've never just been ballet. So, think about that too as you're applying for jobs. And I know especially for younger generations, they're saying that they want to make sure that they're with organizations that align with their values. That's very true of a lot of the institutions that are here, especially cultural institutions. We aren't just ballet for ballet's sake or theater for theater's sake, most of us. So take that into consideration as well. It's not just about those hard skills of being able to write a grant proposal.
It's critical to have the passion and the alignment and to really believe in the work if you're going to get other people to believe in it too. So that's powerful stuff. there's a question in the Q&A actually, which also came up in advance of the session, which is, so once people meet you and, you know, have the character and the values alignment and everything to get a position in development, people want to know more about like what happens on a day-to-day basis, like what is the work of development, and yeah, like it'd be great to just have some specifics for people who are really brand new to it, to think about what they might be doing on a daily basis. I guess maybe focusing more on a kind of entry level rather than what you guys are doing on a daily basis now. I think it would be great to get that fleshed out. Yeah.
A lot of sort of for entry level, a lot of times it's going to be a lot of data management and kind of keeping track of gifts, making sure that gifts are acknowledged in a timely fashion, getting letters out to donors to make sure that they, you know, they're thanked and that they've got their sort of tax receipts and things like that, or managing benefits if your organization has benefits that go along with a donation. So a lot of times those will be the kinds of tasks that you'll learn at an entry level. If you're working in a sort of more of an institutional giving, like foundations or corporations that give, or government grants, it might be a lot of collecting information for reports, working with other departments to get to get sort of information on what their needs are, so that the grants can be written with that in mind, or the reports can be written with that in mind. A lot of kind of sort of data management, really, in a lot of ways, as well as things like proofreading and that kind of thing. And I know there'd also been a question about how to get into grant writing without having that experience yet, and that's actually, if you're working in a smaller team where they might need help with editing or proofreading grants, you always need help with someone proofreading it. So it's a great thing to do, to offer, if you're in a different department, even to offer to help with that, to get that experience, so you can learn kind of how those things are written. Because oftentimes, even with small teams, those of us who write the grants get very protective about language and who's writing them. But those are kind of things I think that the entry level, at least in my role, is often what gets done with the rest of you.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Oliver. And I think one of the great things about development is that there's always variety, but then there's always, like, on the other side, the mundane and the thing that's going to be very predictable. And that's actually a big draw, I think, for development, because it's great when you can come in and not know what's going to happen next. And one day you might be planning a special event. One day you might be talking to a board member. One day you might be compiling an annual report or collecting demographic information. And then one day just has to be reserved for acknowledgement letters. One day has to be the grant, because the grant deadline is coming. So I think when you get that balance, you kind of need it, because you can't just be running on that adrenaline all the time and having those, thrilling moments. Some days you just need to have a day where you are sitting at the computer and writing and doing something more predictable and mundane, just to keep you kind of in check. So I think that's always kind of one of the big draws of the field.
Anyone else? LaTeshia?
Yeah, I can speak to it. When I first started at True Colors, I was definitely entry level, and a lot of the work that I did was about building the relationships and helping those connections happen between program staff and our donors, and being a creative thought leader in figuring out different benefits that will attract donors to the programming and get them excited about what we did at True Colors during that time. And so that was back in 2007 when I first started at True Colors. And so we were just starting our building up our annual fund campaign. And so it was really important to find an entry level for donors at all different levels, so that they can become a guided supporter of the theater.
So what did that involve? Like, what were you doing specifically to make that happen for folks?
Yeah, so specifically, some of the campaigns that I created were driven towards certain zip codes. And so that was some of the research and the data that Matt and Oliver spoke about. That's really important. And if you find that doing research is fun, that's also a good thing in development, right? Sometimes I feel like I'm a sleuth, right? Ducking and hiding and figuring out the backstory of certain donors. it, just simply looking them up on Google, on LinkedIn, to are thinking about segments of donors and what they are most interested in, from age to race to just any type of demographic that, and even something as simple as if they're a foodie. Right. And so and just whatever you can really think about that can segment your population, and how can you speak to them that can get them energized. And so I was at a good place where I was able to contribute in that space. And because we were just building what our annual fund would look like. And being a contributor with my creative background, of course, being an actor, I was also able to speak to the impact of what it meant from the perspective of young people who participate in the arts as well too. And so bringing that toolkit along with you, despite what your activities are, it will be helpful in any entry level position.
It's a great point, because I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that the grant side is a lot more about data and research, and and the individual giving side is more about people interactions and whatever, but it all has so much like really important research that undergirds it to make it successful. So that's a really great point. And sort of along those lines, there's another question in the Q&A about the differences between a kind of, like, we've been talking generally about development, but somebody raised a really good point, like, what are the differences in the kinds of jobs that are really more focused on grants and institutional funding versus the annual funding? And I know you guys, various of you guys have come up through different paths. And I think, Matt, I think I missed a chance for you to do your first job, which I apologize for, but I think a couple of you came on the...
Don't worry about it.
Okay. A couple of you came on the visitor services and individual giving side, and then on the grant side. So love thoughts on those different paths for people coming into development, and what the differences are.
I mean, I will just say, so I started at the YMCA, and that's pretty much how my career has then progressed, because at the YMCA, you're working for a nonprofit. You really are kind of a jack of all trades. And that's kind of how I see myself as a development person as well. But there are definitely organizations that are big and where they have the job segmented out. So you might have a separate grant writer, and that sounds exactly what it is, or a grants manager. You're working on grants. You are in charge of the applications, the reports, the grant calendar. Like, that is your main responsibility. Similarly, there are individual giving people who are responsible for cultivating those major gifts, or looking into, recruiting board members, soliciting individuals out into the community. So, I mean, that's a different avenue as well. Annual fund gets a little bit more broad again. So you can imagine you're kind of developing different pieces that are going to more broadly raise funds for your mission, but you're involved in a lot of creation of like pieces that go out to the public and are communicated. So almost more of like a marketing tie, I tend to think of when I think of an annual fund person. Mm-hmm. What am I missing there, guys? Like, there are other segments for sure, but those are some of the main ones I think about.
Yeah, I would add, depending on the institution, because you're right, Matt, some larger institutions definitely have institutional fundraising departments, and that could be corporate, foundation, government, or a mixture of those. There's major giving, there's membership. There are significantly larger institutions here in New York City, I know, where prospect research is a department in and of itself. Whereas here at Dance Theater, my development associate, I actually have her engage in a lot of that, because I like to give her a very broad overview and understanding of what is a part of fundraising, since I know that this is a career path that she wants to pursue. So while, yes, she does do the behind the scenes database stuff, she also does a lot of the prospect research so that we can continue to build a donor pipeline, mostly on the institutional side. However, she does help with individual giving as well, as far as the prospect research is concerned. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add to that. I think there's that piece.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I love that. I love the way you're talking about mentorship and creating opportunities for people to grow and learn through the field, because I think that's what it's all about, building the next generation of leadership. Kind of along those lines, one thing that I was thinking about in coming here with all of you to talk to a group of folks who are coming into the field, and with bringing a lot of questions about, like, how do I get a job? How do I get someone to respond to my resume? And one thing that I was thinking about is, like, there are organizations that really have a strong organizational culture around development that really are great places to work to raise money. And then sometimes there are places that don't have such a strong sense of organizational culture. And I was just wanting to see if you guys could talk a little bit about thoughts on that, and kind of how people coming into the field can identify a good job and and good leadership around development that's going to provide them with mentoring opportunities and the support they need to succeed. Because I just think that's so important. And I think there can be a tendency for people sometimes to throw a lot on the development department, like, oh, they'll raise all that money, and that can be challenging. So,
well, I was going to say, go to the point of being good at research. I mean, you should definitely, if you're looking into an organization to work there, first thing you do is sort of scour their website to see not just if there's a well-supported and well-invested in development team as listed on a staff listing, but also it's always worth looking at their donor listings to see how well supported the organization is, to see if there's that at least a sort of like a basis of support that you're walking into. And something I always look for, just when I'm curious about an organization, or if I've been looking at a new job particularly, is if there's that support of the board is sort of acknowledged on their donor listing. And if you've got a board that's giving and that's invested and that are potentially then also good advocates and solicitors for the organization, then there's a good culture of philanthropy at that organization. If everywhere is different, not everywhere has the same requirements of a board, but it certainly helps if you see that an organization is well supported by its board, and that could well mean that it's a place that relies a little too heavily, and maybe that's something that needs to change. But it's certainly a good start if you know that the board is invested in the organization, both financially themselves, but also it's also a good question to sort of ask in an interview is about the culture of the board and if the board is engaged in philanthropy, because some places they can write a check and move on, and some places they can really help support and bring in support themselves, which is really crucial to making sure there's that baseline that you can build on.
I think I will definitely like to add diversity as well too, especially being a person of color. Definitely look at that diversity on the board and how they value that in their work as well too, on the stage as well as behind the scenes. So that's very important. Also, in addition to what Oliver mentioned about the board, I've been taught that you can also draw a line if you look at the corporate sponsors with the board and where they work as well too. That's a good way of being able to tell how the board supports the institution. If they're bringing along the corporate, the employers with them to support the institutions that they care about, that says a lot, I think, as well.
I think so much of whether or not you're going to be a good fit for an organization is based upon kind of personally where you are at. The culture I would have fit into when I was 24 is much different than the culture that I fit into now. So just thinking about that, some people don't mind a challenge. Some people don't feel like they need to go into an organization knowing that they're going to meet all of the goals. Like maybe they just want to bring stability. Maybe they just want to work towards the end of a campaign, or, so some people are really comfortable with different organizations and where they're at in their life cycle and how they might fit in and be able to contribute. So looking for that good fit is really important. And I would, you get that opportunity at the end of any interview to ask questions. And I would just make sure that you ask those executives and those leaders in the organization, like, 1 year from now, 2 years from now, if this hire were not to work out, why would that be? And I think that will tell you a lot about like whether you fit in and whether that culture is right for you.
That's a great question. I love that.
I love that as well. I forgot to mention professional development as well too. That's also a key indicator if the leadership is interested in investing in its staff, and so that lets you know how they feel about their staff and how, the importance of how they feel about their staff growing in their professional goals.
Well, that's actually kind of a cool segue. Another question that came in advance was about resources for people to continue their own education and development, and what folks recommend that people should look to for that. And then more specifically, whether specific certifications like for Salesforce or Tessitura or other, or Razor's Edge, like, are those things that are worth people pursuing? And then I know a couple of you have graduate degrees in nonprofit administration, and like as part of this whole package, maybe interesting just to hear a little bit about how that's been productive for you and whether that's something you recommend for others.
For me, it was just always, as I mentioned earlier, had a dual interest in the business and the performing arts side of my particular field of dance. So I always knew that I was going to go back to graduate school and study this. For me, it was really a deep desire and interest to understand the business side of how, as not-for-profit institutions especially, work. It's a little different. And then it is certainly a little bit more nuanced when you're talking about the performing arts, what we need, why we need it, how we need to talk about it, all of those things. It's a little bit different. I forgot the question. What was the first part of the question? It's the end of the workday, y'all here.
Resources for
and the resources,
learning.
yes.
Yeah, like where people can find.
Yeah, for me, do I personally feel like I need to be certified in Tessitura or Black Bond Razor's Edge? No, I don't. I have some colleagues who have done that certification, nonprofit professional certification fundraisers. I don't feel the need to do that. And I actually, several years ago, asked a colleague who did get that certification, and she was like, it's not worth it. For me, it is up to me to stay abreast of what's going on in this field, to continue to read up on the trends that are happening in this field. There are tons of resources online. There are tons of now Zoom conferences and everything. I think the self-education piece is important to me. That's how I choose to prepare myself as a leader. But I do certainly make it my business to take time at least once a week to read a couple of articles to see what's going on around us so that I can make informed decisions as I move forward as the Director of Development for Dance Theater.
And do you have favorite sites that you're looking at for that?
I'm definitely a Chronicle of Philanthropy woman, hands down. I just think they touch on so many different areas. It's not just the arts, it's not just education, but you can certainly glean from other sectors what's going on and how to then make it applicable to what we're doing here. So, because there's always going to be some crossover.
I would say briefly on the Tessitura type training. Tessitura is something that which is a database for those of you who haven't been familiar with it, but I worked with a few organizations that use it. I've never had any training on it. I just worked with it and worked with people to sort of learn about it and got really invested in it as not just as a database, but as a sort of community. It's a very useful community of people to sort of share ideas and beyond just how to use the database. And I just felt really that the experience itself is what's really crucial there, getting the sort of training or certification. I don't know that people really even notice that. I mean, I've presented at several of their conferences and put that on my resume, and no one's ever noticed that. I always get the question, have you ever used Tessitura? Like, well, if you'd gotten to the bottom and seen, you'd have known that. But I just feel like that being able to sort of talk about it from experience is far more important. So I would just encourage, even if you're working get an internship where the organization has a database or some kind of software like that you could just at least try out. Gaining the experience is what's going to be the most important thing.
Just to add, I agree that it's important to receive certificates. I receive certificates. I go to actually the Georgia Center for Nonprofits. I like to add those to my resume. I think it not only continues to grow my own community among development professionals, but it also prepares me for more opportunities as well too. I did receive a master's degree. I don't know if you can see it on the back wall. But yeah, I did receive a master's degree, and similar to Ebonie, it's because I already knew I was going to have an interest in the business side already. I don't think it's necessary for you to get a degree in arts management because it's so expensive as well too. But if you are interested in the business side and you're more on the artistic or programming side, I would definitely encourage you to move forward in looking into certificates, even if it's outside of the artistic realm. Like I said, I've learned so much from people who are not in the arts. And also it continues to grow your opportunities as well too. If by chance you decide to leave the arts, you can. And there are plenty of opportunities for you to continue this profession and grow as a development professional in other nonprofit sectors.
Yeah, it's so true. I have a certificate for advanced concentration in integrated liberal studies from the University of Wisconsin, and my colleague tells me that's worthless, and I think they're right. So yes, I know education is great, and continuing education is great. And with the nature of the world right now and how much information is out there, you can do a web search and get so many articles on whatever you're looking into. And you will just find it out there. So it is out there for the taking. And definitely then when you attend those seminars, like a lot of reading will come up that kind of becomes required reading, and whether it's nonprofit business management or fundraising or anything like that, but you'll start to see those pop up as well. I come back to certain ones like Good to Great. I think Good to Great, even though it's an older nonprofit management book, it's a great one. And then there's one that Rock Schulfer from the Goodman Theater always references in his talks. It's The Economics of Nonprofit Theater. I think that's the name of it, but it's a really old publication, but it's fascinating, and it should be required reading for anyone who's looking to come into nonprofit business management and specifically the arts.
That's awesome. I love that there are books that you can read. It's very refreshingly old school to think about diving into it, but like obviously there's such a vast literature out there of stuff that you can learn from to get a grounding. It's great. Another question that came up was really about networking, and LaTeshia, I think you were talking earlier about networking as tool of the trade in development. But also, like, what are the spaces that people can network to get connected to people in the field? A lot of times that kind of opening of meeting somebody is such a great way to get a job, so that someone can get that sense of your values and your commitment and all of that, your character, before sitting down for an interview and such. So what are the spaces that folks can find to meet other development professionals?
TCG. That's my main place, honestly. Yeah, I am also a beneficiary of one of their Spark Leaders of Color, one of their programs. And so they also provide circles of admin professionals, different. And so they have artistic and also development. And so participating in those conversations and meeting others who are doing the work is what I lean into mostly.
The dance community would be Dance USA, or here in New York City, specifically Dance NYC. But also, honestly, it's you meet one person, and then hopefully that next person will introduce you to the next person and the next person and the next person. I mean, I have a whole group of African-American women actually who work in development who I met through one other person. But that's exactly what it is. Development is developing relationships. And that's a huge part of where the networking piece comes into play. So while there are institutions that can help with the networking. Also, someone else mentioned earlier, I think it was LaTeshia, don't be afraid to actually just reach out to someone. I love it when people just send me a cold email and want to have a conversation. I tend to do lots of little talks with some colleges and universities, I'm in classes as a guest speaker. I encourage them to email me afterwards. Ask whatever question you would like. I'm happy to answer it, and to help kind of be a guide in that space. So, put yourself out there. You'll get more yeses than nos, I promise you.
It's a great point that I think that it's a core skill of development to do that kind of outreach. So if you're putting yourself out there in that way, you're also demonstrating that you have the skills needed to do a development job. So it's a win-win, I think, which is great. Awesome. Well, I think we just have time for one more question, and I wanted to leave people with some of your best hard-won knowledge. So what is a piece of advice that you learned the hard way, and how did you learn it?
Yeah, it's such a frightening question to answer, but I'll go ahead and take a stab at it. So for me, it's about avoiding the highs and the lows. I take a marathon approach to being in this field. I'm a marathon runner, so you learn a lot about, like, you got to appreciate the good miles, but you can't get too down when you have those bad miles. And very similarly in development, you're only as good as your last success, and you're never as bad as that failure that you had. So, and I learned it the hard way. I remember when I was just first applying for development jobs, part of the interview process was to call up the supervisor, get their voicemail, and pretend that I was making a pitch to them to give money. And it just felt so contrived and also just so hard and artificial. But I wanted to make a good impression, and I got the voicemail, and the voicemail is obviously not some random person you're trying to get money from. It's their work voicemail, so you know exactly who you're talking to, but you have to try to pretend. And I just had like a panic attack and couldn't do it, like literally just stumbled. And then it's like a bad movie where it's like it's out there in space, it's on the machine, and I can't get it back. So then you call back and apologize and make it worse. And yeah, it was painful, but again, I'm not defined by that moment, and that did not deter me from going into the development field. So, leave it behind you and go on to that next mile.
That's right. Persistence and carrying on is what it's really about. That's great. LaTeshia?
Yeah, I think being able to say this doesn't work anymore I learned the hard way, especially involving event fundraising and pivoting and figuring out how to do the work when the return on investment was so low. So just figuring out how to say this isn't working anymore. And even when the organizational culture, you're butting heads with leadership or board members, just trying to navigate those situations. And what was helpful for me was finding a board member who understood, who could be an advocate, and overcoming that. And then also I had a staff member, right, who was really entrenched in the process with me, helped to open my eyes to realize, oh, you're right, this is crazy. This is, and so sometimes we can get so used to the grind of what a ongoing annual event is that we don't take the time to step back and say, this part isn't working anymore, and we need to change and do something different.
So when I got this question, I was trying to see if I couldn't remember like a specific example, and I can't, but I could have blocked it out, quite frankly. I'm going to go with that. I just blocked out whatever it was. But I will say, especially for those who are looking to go into this field and all the questions around, what to look for in an organization, know that bigger isn't always better. It might be shinier, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's more organized or that they have the resources and the support and the infrastructure behind the scenes to be able to support what you're trying to do as an employee, as a development team, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess to the earlier question, that would be one of the questions to ask, is to make sure that that the organization has the resources necessary for your employees to be successful?
I think there's a sort of general piece of advice I would say, which is always listen and be open to listening and hearing from other people. Obviously, you're here listening to us, so hopefully you're learning something today. But in terms of how that would apply to development, I think it's always really important to listen to your donors, not just to get to know them better, to build those connections we were talking about, but also every donor is different and every ask is different, and it's really easy in this industry to want to just write the same letter every time or send off the same proposal, and once you've done one, hopefully you've done all of them. But everybody kind of responds a little bit differently, and I as an example of a major donor, when I started in this role at Classic Stage a few years ago, when I started, I was told you're gonna have to deal with Bob because he's really unhappy. No one's talked to him for a while. He might not renew. And I kind of thought, oh, I know exactly that type. He just wants to have the friend at the company to call and talk to. So I called him, I introduced myself, and I was really pleased that he upgraded that year. And then the next year, I sort of thought, having spent all year trying to actually meet him in person and never getting to meet him, thinking he just wanted a friend, he didn't renew and he didn't kind of respond. And I ended up having a conversation with him to say, just want to check and make sure everything was okay. And he said, well, no one really told me that they needed my money this year. They didn't really ask me. They didn't ask me and tell me why it was important. So I figured you didn't even need it. And I realized that it wasn't that he just needed another friend, but he wanted to be needed. And I hadn't done a good job of kind of listening and reading between the lines and figuring that out to make the right kind of ask. Thankfully he's back on side now, but I did kind of learn that lesson the hard way, that you really do need to listen with all your kind of listening sources. That can really make the difference with when asking for donations.
Well, that's great. Well, I think we are at the end of our time, and I hope that all of you out there have really gained a lot from these amazing professionals, from their diverse experience and the questions we've been able to answer from your wonderful questions. And go out there, do the work, make the hard calls, network, and really think about the skills you have and how you can bring them to this field, because I think we really need you. We need all of you, and look forward to working with many of you in the future, I hope. So
thank you so much. Thanks, Bryony, and thank you to all of our panelists, Ebonie and LaTeshia, Matt, and Oliver. You guys are, we have to say, the unsung heroes working on the program side. We love our development department, so an extra special shout out to our Director of Development, Laura Michelle Talbot, and our Development Assistant, Angelica Vicens. We are so grateful to all of you here and all of you joining who are future development leaders. Thank you for coming.